Millionaire divorces wife unaware she's pregnant. Months later, he's asked to save her and their twins. The phone rang while Fern was in the middle of a contract negotiation worth more than most people's lifetimes. He barely glanced at the screen before rejecting the call. Then it rang again. Same number. Unknown. Hospitals never call twice by mistake. By the time he reached the parking garage, his hands were already shaking. Now he was running through a maze of beige hallways that all looked the same. Suit jacket flapping open, tie forgotten somewhere between panic and disbelief. His shoes were wrong for this place. Expensive leather striking sterile tile, loud enough that a nurse looked up in concern. He didn't slow down. He couldn't. His mind refused to keep pace with his body. The words from the call kept repeating, blunt and impossible. Your former wife has been admitted following an accident. Nothing about how serious, nothing about how long, just enough information to rip the floor from under his world. He reached the ward desk, breath shallow, pulse racing, a man who had negotiated boardrooms into silence, now unable to form a sentence. Delaney Shore, he managed. Where is she? The doctor didn't look like someone about to change a man's entire life. Mid-40s, soft voice, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows. He studied a clipboard while Fern stood in front of him like a schoolboy waiting for punishment. She's stable, the doctor said first, and Fern's lungs finally remembered how to work. But she's not awake yet. We've had to sedate her while we monitor internal trauma. Fern nodded, pretending he understood the terms, pretending his world was still arranged in clear columns and rows. Then the doctor added, almost casually, there's something else you need to know. Your former wife is pregnant. Fern felt the floor tilt. Excuse me? Twins, the doctor continued, roughly 20 weeks along. The hallway didn't echo. It closed in. All the months since the divorce, the nights, the headlines, the empty penthouse, collapsed into a single unbearable truth. Delaney had been living an entire life he never saw, carrying 2 children he had never imagined. Pregnant, with twins, he had left her alone in more ways than one. A nurse handed him a clipboard, the kind he'd signed 1,000 times in boardrooms without reading the fine print. This one was different. His name was already typed at the bottom, as if the hospital had decided something about his life before he even understood it himself. These are consent forms, she said gently, in case emergency intervention becomes necessary for the babies. The babies. The phrase didn't land with warmth. It struck with weight. He scanned the page, words blurring together procedures, authorizations, contingencies, all tied to 2 children who had been growing quietly inside the woman he walked away from. His hand hovered over the pen. This wasn't an investment. It wasn't damage control. This was fatherhood arriving without warning, without ceremony, without his permission, but fully demanding his responsibility. I didn't know, he whispered, not to the nurse, not to anyone in particular. She didn't rush him. She just stood there, patient, letting him absorb the truth that had finally caught up to him. He could not negotiate his way out of this moment. While Fern stared at those pages, a truth most people never want to face settled over him. Sometimes relationships don't end with shouting or slammed doors. Sometimes they end in ordinary days that keep repeating until no one is left trying. Maybe you've lived that without even noticing it at the time. Not the dramatic breakups everyone talks about. The quieter kind. The missed dinners. The calls you promise yourself you'll return after one more task. The belief that presence can always be postponed. Have you ever lost someone not because you hurt them outright, but because you slowly stopped showing up? Fern didn't betray Delaney. He didn't raise his voice or walk out in the middle of the night. He just kept choosing other things, deadlines, meetings, progress, until the person who once knew every version of him couldn't recognize the man standing in front of her. And by the time he realized what he had traded away, she had already carried on alone. In a matter of minutes, Fern had become something he never planned for. A father who missed the beginning, a husband who learned too late what he should have protected. 2 children were waiting on the other side of a closed door, their entire existence hidden behind paperwork and medical terms. He hadn't been there for the first heartbeat. He hadn't known their names. He hadn't felt the weight of the months that carried them forward. Yet he was being asked to step in now, when the stakes could not be higher. What kind of man becomes a parent at the same moment he understands the depth of his own failure? That question will carry this story to its end. And if you believe real stories aren't about perfection but about showing up when it finally matters, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Mr. Williams Storytime so you never miss another chapter that tells the truth about love, loss, and second chances. The cafe sat between a closed laundromat and a pawn shop that advertised guitars it never seemed to sell. The sign above the door had lost 2 letters years ago, leaving a crooked name no one bothered to fix. Inside, the air smelled like burned espresso and old furniture polish. It wasn't the kind of place anyone took photos of. It was the kind of place people went when they were trying not to think too hard about where their life was heading. Fern had been there since early morning, hunched over a table that leaned slightly to the left, no matter how many folded napkins he stuffed beneath one leg. His laptop screen was frozen on a blank spreadsheet, cursor blinking like it was mocking him. He'd rebooted twice already. The machine made a faint whining noise every time he tried to open the financial model he'd been building for weeks. Across the room, a college student argued quietly with a barista about whether oat milk counted as real milk. An older man in a trucker hat read the same newspaper page over and over, pretending not to watch the rain slide down the window. Fern rubbed his eyes. He had worn the same jacket for 3 interviews that month, hoping no one would notice the seam splitting under the arm. He hadn't eaten anything since the night before, but the idea of spending $6 on a sandwich made him feel reckless. The laptop stuttered again, then went dark. He stared at the black screen longer than he should have, as if intensity alone could shame it back to life. When nothing happened, he leaned back in his chair and laughed once, not the amused kind, but the sound people make when they don't know what else to do. That was when a voice from the next table said, "Either you just lost a fortune, or that thing finally gave up on you." He turned his head. The woman sitting nearby had a sketchbook open in front of her, pencil smudges on her fingers. Her coffee had gone cold. "Both, probably," he said. She smiled, not polite, curious. The kind that makes a room feel less like a holding area and more like a place where something might actually begin. She slid her chair closer without asking, as if the empty space between them had already made the decision. "May I?" she said, pointing at the laptop. Fern hesitated. The machine looked like it might collapse from embarrassment if another person touched it. Still, he nodded and turned the screen toward her. "It was working fine yesterday," he said, already defensive. "I just needed to open this file, that's all." She leaned in, studying the dull reflection in the glass. "Computers are like people," she said. "They perform best when they're not under pressure. That makes one of us." She laughed, then reached into her bag and pulled out a slim toolkit. Not the bulky kind with wires and drills, just a tiny screwdriver and a cleaning cloth. "You carry that around with you?" he asked. "Art school teaches you to prepare for disaster. Charcoal dust is a menace." She unscrewed the back panel with care, like she was handling something fragile instead of obsolete. Dust bloomed onto the table. Fern winced. "That's probably not good." "It's honest," she replied. "Machines choke when they can't breathe." He watched her work, hands steady, no rush. It was strange how calm she made him feel when he'd spent the last year measuring every moment like a countdown. When she finished, she closed the lid and slid it back toward him. "Try now." The screen flickered. Then the startup logo appeared. Fern didn't speak. He just stared, then looked at her like she'd performed something sacred. "Told you," she said. "Sometimes all it takes is someone paying attention." "Delaney," she said when he finally found his voice. "That's my name." He repeated it once, quietly, like he was testing the sound. "Fern." She nodded, satisfied, as if names mattered more than resumes. He told her about the model he was building, not in business jargon, but in clumsy fragments, the way people speak when they're afraid of being misunderstood. He had an idea for a company that could streamline logistics for small manufacturers. Nothing flashy, just something that solved problems no one else wanted to touch. "I keep thinking I'm behind," he admitted. "Everyone else from my program already has a job." Delaney closed her sketchbook and turned her chair fully toward him. "Behind who?" He opened his mouth, then stopped. He'd never actually met the people he was racing against. They were just ghosts in his head. "You know," he said weakly, "everyone—" She tilted her head. "Everyone doesn't exist." The simplicity of it stunned him. She flipped the sketchbook open again, showing him a half-finished drawing of the cafe, the uneven tables, the cracked tiles, the woman by the door staring into her phone like it held her future. "This place isn't impressive," she said, "but it's real, and you're here, trying. That counts for something." No one had spoken to him that way in months. Not with advice, not with pity, just with a steady belief that he wasn't already losing. When he asked what she did, she shrugged. "I paint. I work part-time wherever I can. I'm not building anything yet." He smiled. "You just fixed a laptop. That feels like something." They began meeting there without calling it a plan. Some days Fern would already be at the crooked table when Delaney arrived, coffee in hand, hair tied up in a way that made her look like she'd rushed out the door without thinking too hard about mirrors. Other times she beat him to it, sketching strangers or rewriting lyrics she never finished. The cafe became their neutral ground, not a date spot, not an office, just a place where effort felt lighter because it was shared. They traded dreams in pieces. Fern talked about wanting to build something that actually mattered to people who didn't have investors or headlines. Delaney spoke about opening a studio someday, a place where kids who couldn't afford lessons could still learn how to see the world differently. Some nights they stayed until the barista stacked chairs around them, working through failures that felt less heavy when someone else was there to witness them. Fernie's proposals were rejected. Delaney's art shows were passed over. Neither one pretended it didn't hurt. They learned how to celebrate small things, a reply email, a decent sketch, the laptop surviving another week. Their laughter wasn't loud, but it lasted longer than most victories. In those hours, no one was impressive. No one was invisible. They were just two people building a quiet life out of persistence and proximity. It didn't feel like history being made. It felt like survival, the honest kind that leaves room for hope. Inside offices that reflected his face back at him from every surface. Floors that shone without effort. Walls that carried no memory of the hands that built them. People would lean forward when he spoke, not because they knew him, but because of the company logo stitched into his suit. Yet none of those rooms would feel as alive as that forgotten cafe. Back then, success had been a rumor, not a guarantee. The chairs were uneven, the lights flickered when the espresso machine kicked on, and the world outside the rain-streaked windows didn't care who he hoped to become. But Delaney had cared. Not about outcomes, about him. That was the difference. Before the penthouse, before the interviews, before the calendar that never emptied, there had been a woman who saw him when he had nothing to show for himself except effort. And somewhere between those crooked tables and the polished lobbies he would one day inhabit, Fern forgot that love doesn't follow achievement. It grows in places most people walk past without ever looking inside. The first office Fern rented after his company secured real funding wasn't impressive. It had no reception desk, no glass walls, no security gate that made visitors feel important. It was 3 cramped rooms above a travel agency that never seemed to close, with printers that overheated if you asked too much of them. But it was his. What began as late nights spent fixing broken spreadsheets in a forgotten cafe turned into investor calls that stretched across time zones. He stopped setting alarms because sleep had become optional. Every breakthrough was followed by a fresh problem that demanded attention immediately, and Fern learned to thrive on the pressure the way some people thrive on applause. Delaney tried to follow his ascent at first. She brought takeout to the office when meetings ran long. She helped organize scattered notes when his team doubled, then tripled. The walls filled with whiteboards and charts, and Fern's voice grew sharper, more efficient, as though warmth had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Success arrived quietly, then all at once. One week he was worried about payroll. The next he was fielding calls from partners who used words like expansion and aggressive growth. He didn't notice when he stopped asking Delaney if she wanted to come along. He simply assumed she understood, because in his mind everything he was building was still for them. Needed the space, but because Fern's advisors insisted it made sense, a sign that things were stable, a marker of arrival. Delaney walked through the front door for the first time alone. The rooms were so large that her footsteps seemed embarrassed to echo. The furniture arrived in pieces wrapped in plastic that crinkled like it had something to hide. She wandered from one end of the living room to the other, counting the windows, wondering why she already missed the cafe that had smelled like burned coffee and optimism. Fern was on the phone when she tried to show him the kitchen, then again when the movers asked where the last box should go. He smiled at her between calls, brief, automatic, the way people acknowledge passing strangers. Dinner that night sat untouched in warming trays until the clock on the microwave blinked past midnight. Delaney ate standing up, scrolling through messages that never turned into conversations. She sent him a photo of the empty table with the caption, "I saved your seat." He replied hours later with a single word, "Tomorrow." Tomorrow arrived without him. At first Delaney blamed the house, the unfamiliar sounds, the way the air moved through rooms too large for 2 people. She told herself that once Fern settled into the new schedule, the emptiness would lift, so she started calling him more. Sometimes it was about nothing, a stray cat she'd seen in the yard, a half-finished painting that finally made sense. Other times she didn't know why she dialed at all, only that the silence pressed in too close when she didn't. Most calls went straight to his assistant. When he did answer, his voice was clipped, pulled tight by urgency. "Can I call you back?" became his most reliable phrase. She began to measure conversations in seconds, collecting fragments instead of moments. They ate in the same house without sharing meals. Plates waited in the refrigerator like evidence of intentions that never became reality. The dining room chandelier stayed dark because no one felt like flipping the switch. Delaney learned to leave messages that didn't ask for anything. She was afraid of sounding needy, afraid that wanting to be heard might be mistaken for weakness. She still believed it was temporary. But silence, once it finds space, rarely leaves on its own. The words came out one night without rehearsal. No raised voices, no slammed doors. Just a sentence that had waited too long to be said. Fern was loosening his tie in the bedroom, phone pressed to his ear, half listening to a conference update while scrolling through figures on a tablet. Delaney stood in the doorway for a full minute before he noticed. "I'm here," she said. "Just a second," he replied automatically, finger raised. She waited. The call stretched on. When he finally hung up, she hadn't moved. "You don't see me anymore," she said. He frowned, genuinely confused. "Of course I do." "When?" Her voice stayed calm, which somehow made the room feel smaller. "Not when you're here physically. When do you actually notice me?" He searched for examples and found none that didn't sound like obligations. He talked about deadlines, about how much was riding on the next quarter, about how hard it was to keep everything afloat. "I'm doing this for us," he said. Delaney shook her head slowly. "I don't feel like part of that us anymore." The sentence didn't accuse, it revealed, and Fern, for the first time, felt the unease of someone realizing that success had been standing between him and the person he loved, and he had thanked it for the distance. They sat on opposite sides of the bed, a stretch of expensive fabric separating two people who once fit inside a single cafe booth. "I can't slow down right now," Fern said, keeping his voice level, like he was negotiating terms instead of trying to save a marriage. "We're finally where we need to be. This is the moment that defines everything after." Delaney folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not asking you to quit, I'm asking you to stay." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, explaining growth curves and market windows, the way opportunities closed if you hesitated. To him, it all sounded practical, sensible, protective. "If I let up, I put our future at risk." "Our future," she repeated quietly, tasting the words. "I need you now, Fern, not when everything is finished." He didn't dismiss her. He didn't raise his voice. He just couldn't find space for her inside the logic that governed his days, so he promised later. And she heard what he didn't mean to say, that later had already become a habit. The boardroom sat on the 42nd floor, high enough that clouds drifted past the windows like they had somewhere better to be. The table was so long that it seemed designed to prevent anyone from getting too close to anyone else. Black leather chairs stood evenly spaced, untouched, as if the room had been arranged for a photograph rather than a goodbye. Delaney arrived first. She chose a seat halfway down the table, placing her purse carefully beneath the chair as though she were about to attend a quarterly review instead of ending a marriage. The walls were bare except for a framed mission statement that promised innovation and excellence in language so polished it could have applied to anything. When Fern entered, there was no tension in the air. No one stiffened. No one cleared their throat. They exchanged a nod that felt more appropriate for strangers who had once shared a taxi. The folder in front of Delaney was thick, its edges aligned with mathematical precision. She didn't open it right away. She stared at the grain of the table instead, remembering when they used to fold napkins to keep cafe furniture from wobbling. Across from her, Fern loosened his cufflinks and waited. He had prepared for negotiations, for pushback, for delay. What he hadn't prepared for was how quiet the room felt when nothing was being fought over. The attorneys arrived with identical leather portfolios and identical neutral expressions. They took their seats without ceremony, laying out documents in tidy stacks, aligning pages the way surgeons prepare instruments. No one asked how anyone was doing. The first page slid across the table toward Delaney. She read the heading, then the smaller text beneath it, words she'd already seen too many times to pretend they still held power. Dissolution, settlement, finalization. Fern watched her read, waiting for a reaction that never came. She didn't tighten her jaw. She didn't blink back tears. She turned the page and reached for the pen when instructed, as if she were approving a vendor contract. They signed in silence, names written in ink that dried too quickly. Dates that marked the end of something that once felt indestructible. A junior associate coughed, then apologized for interrupting nothing at all. When it was Fern's turn, he hesitated for a fraction of a second, not enough to stop the process, just enough to acknowledge it existed. Then he signed too. If anyone had raised their voice, if anyone had objected, the room might have felt human. But efficiency ruled. The absence of emotion made everything final. They were nearly finished when Delaney spoke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rehearsed. It carried the kind of steadiness that comes from deciding you no longer need permission to tell the truth. "I loved you before any of this," she said, eyes on the page in front of her rather than on him. The lawyers froze in place, pens hovering like they'd been caught mid-movement. Fern looked up, caught off guard by the absence of accusation in her voice. "Before the offices," she continued. "Before the house, before people cared what your last name could open." She closed the folder gently. The sound was small, but it drew every eye in the room. "I didn't fall in love with the version of you who signs papers all day," she said. "I fell in love with a man who stayed up late in a broken cafe, trying to build something honest." Fern opened his mouth to respond, but nothing fit. Gratitude would have been wrong. Apology felt incomplete. Delaney wasn't looking for answers. She was naming the distance finally, so it didn't have to linger unspoken between lines of legal text. The final page lay between them, waiting for signatures that would turn months of silence into something official. Delaney took the pen, then stopped. She lifted her eyes to Fern for the first time since entering the room. "You didn't stop loving me," she said. "You stopped choosing me." The words didn't carry blame. They carried clarity. Fern felt them more than he heard them, like a diagnosis you can't argue with. He had always believed love was a constant, something that survived neglect as long as it existed in theory. Delaney had lived the difference between belief and action. She signed her name and slid the folder toward him. He stared at the ink, at the date, at the sudden truth that this was the last shared decision they would ever make. When he signed, the pen didn't shake. That would come later, in places with no witnesses. The attorneys gathered their papers with quiet efficiency, already shifting attention to whatever meeting came next. The room returned to its neutral state, as if two lives hadn't just been permanently redirected across its polished surface. Delaney stood first. She slipped her purse over her shoulder and gave Fern a nod that contained neither anger nor hope, just completion. He remained seated for a moment after she left, staring at the empty chair across from him, half expecting it to hold some sign of what had just ended. It didn't. "Before we move on, let me ask you something. Do you think love usually collapses with arguments and slammed doors, or does it fade the way this one did, in orderly rooms with steady hands and no one raising their voice? If this moment feels familiar in any way, share your thoughts in the comments." Delaney chose the earliest appointment she could find, the kind scheduled before the city had fully woken. The clinic sat between a nail salon and a vacant storefront with paper taped over the windows. Nothing about it suggested turning points. It looked like a place people went to cross items off a list. She checked in at the front desk, gave her name, then took a seat in a row of molded plastic chairs that were cold no matter how long you sat in them. A television mounted in the corner played a muted morning show where the host smiled at jokes no one in the room could hear. Most of the chairs were empty. Across from her, a poster explained hydration in pastel colors. Another showed a smiling couple holding hands, their joy arranged for marketing purposes. Delaney didn't look at either. She folded her hands in her lap and watched the clock instead, each second pushing her farther away from the life she'd just signed away. She had come alone on purpose. There was no one left who was supposed to be here with her. Friends would have offered comfort. Fern would have offered solutions. She wanted neither. When the nurse finally called her name, Delaney stood so quickly that the chair scraped the floor, loud in a room that had learned to be quiet. The examination room was small enough that Delaney could touch both walls if she stretched her arms. The paper sheet on the table crinkled beneath her as she sat, feet dangling just above the floor. The doctor entered with a smile practiced for first meetings. He asked routine questions, reviewed her chart, then turned the monitor slightly so they could both see. "I'm going to show you what we're seeing," he said. The screen brightened. Shapes appeared that took her a moment to recognize. Then he pointed. "There are two." She blinked. "Two what?" "Heartbeats," he said gently. "You're carrying twins." The word landed without sound. Twins. She repeated it in her head like a language she didn't speak yet. The doctor kept talking, explaining measurements, timelines, what the next months might require. Delaney heard none of it. Her gaze fixed on the small movements on the screen, proof of a life that had been happening without her awareness. "Two." She nodded at the appropriate moments, even smiled once, because that's what people do when they receive news that should feel joyful. Inside, everything went still. She left the room with a thin folder tucked under her arm and a weight in her chest she couldn't measure. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. People passed her on their way in, chatting into phones, adjusting coats, moving through the day as though it hadn't just split open. Delaney walked past the elevator and took the stairs instead. She needed the quiet. Each step felt like it required instruction, as if her body had forgotten how to carry news that didn't fit inside it. In the parking lot, she stood beside her car without unlocking it. The folder pressed against her ribs, the paper inside more real than anything she'd signed in that boardroom. She thought of Fern then, not the man who had walked out of her life with careful handwriting, but the one who once fixed a broken laptop in a forgotten cafe with nothing but patience and borrowed tools. The memory came uninvited, sharp in a way nostalgia never is. She didn't cry. Shock has a way of borrowing all the air in a room. For the first time since the divorce, Delaney had something she couldn't share, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't yet know what it meant. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine off, the parking lot emptying around her. The morning had moved on without permission. The clinic door opened and closed behind strangers who had no idea what she was carrying inside her. Delaney reached for her phone before she could think better of it. Fern's name was still where it had always been, near the top of her recent calls, untouched since the boardroom. She opened the contact, thumb hovering over the button that would connect her to the life she had just left. Her mind filled in the possibilities too quickly. He would apologize. He would offer solutions. He would insist on being involved immediately, decisively, the way he handled every problem that landed on his desk. And she wasn't sure whether that would feel like relief or like being erased all over again. The car around her felt too quiet for choices this large. She closed her eyes, then locked the screen. The phone slipped back into her purse like a secret that wasn't ready to be spoken. Delaney didn't start the car right away. She stayed there, hands resting on the steering wheel, as if waiting for instructions that never came. The world beyond the windshield had already returned to its rhythm, doors opening, engines turning over, conversations rising and fading, but none of it applied to her anymore. Two lives were moving forward inside her, indifferent to boardrooms and legal documents, unaware that the man who should have been sitting beside her didn't even know they existed. She finally started the engine and pulled into traffic, letting the road choose her direction for a few blocks before she recognized the street names again. By the time she reached the edge of town, the decision had settled into something steady. She would not call today, not out of anger, out of instinct. There were things that needed space to exist before they could be explained, and this was one of them. For now, she would carry the truth quietly, learning its weight on her own terms. Sometimes secrets aren't kept to hurt anyone. Sometimes they're kept to survive. Delaney chose the town because no one there knew her name. It sat just beyond the highways people used to get somewhere else, a place with one main street, two traffic lights that never seemed to agree with each other, and storefronts that closed for lunch because the owners preferred to eat at home. She arrived with a single suitcase, a portfolio of unfinished paintings, and a car that had seen better decades. The apartment above the hardware store smelled faintly of paint thinner and old cardboard. The landlord, a woman with silver hair pulled into a practical knot, showed her the space without commentary. One bedroom, a narrow kitchen, windows that rattled when trucks passed below. It wasn't much, but it didn't belong to anyone else. That mattered. Delaney set her bags down and stood in the middle of the empty room, letting the quiet settle. No assistance, no headlines, no explanations required. She'd had left behind a life that looked impressive on paper and arrived somewhere that barely noticed her presence. For the first time since the boardroom, she didn't feel like she was leaving something. She felt like she was arriving. The school hired her the same week she finished unpacking. The art room had once been a storage closet and still smelled faintly of bleach. The tables were scarred by years of projects no one remembered, and the cabinet doors hung crooked on tired hinges. Delaney loved it instantly. The children didn't care where she had come from. They only wanted to know if she would let them mix colors that weren't on the chart and draw people with purple hair. She said yes to everything the budget allowed. She spent her lunch breaks scrubbing dried glue from brushes and sketching lesson plans in the margins of old worksheets. Some afternoons she stayed late to help students finish pieces they were too proud to abandon. They told her about parents who worked double shifts, about houses that felt too small, about dreams that lived in notebooks no one else had opened. Delaney listened without fixing, the way she once wished someone had listened to her. The room filled slowly, not with supplies but with trust. She went home tired, clothes dusted with chalk, hands smelling of tempera paint, carrying the quiet sense that she had finally found work that asked for her whole self. Her paycheck barely covered rent and groceries. The rest of her expenses learned to wait. Delaney kept a notebook on the kitchen counter, tracking numbers with the care Fern once reserved for forecasts. Power, gas, food. She crossed out anything that didn't qualify as necessary. New shoes became a luxury. Eating out turned into a memory. She never spoke about it at school. When the coffee machine in the teacher's lounge broke, she filled her mug with hot water in a tea bag she'd brought from home. When the landlord raised the rent by $50, she recalculated the grocery list and moved on. At night she painted for herself, not for galleries or grants. Just small canvases she could afford, colors stretched thin, finding beauty in restraint. The pregnancy showed slowly, a subtle curve she disguised with loose sweaters. She didn't mind the secrecy. It felt protective, a boundary she hadn't been good at keeping before. There were moments when exhaustion sat heavy in her bones, when she wished she could share the burden with someone else, but complaints never crossed her lips. This was her life now, and she was learning how to hold it. The names arrived one evening while she was washing dishes, the water running too hot because the heater had only 2 settings. The plate slipped in her hands, bumping against the side of the sink with a sharp clink that made her pause. She pressed a palm against her stomach, a gesture that had become instinct, even though the movement inside her was still more imagination than sensation. "Jax," she said aloud, testing the sound. It felt solid, like a promise that didn't need decoration. She smiled to herself and tried another. "Jolie." The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. She leaned back against the counter, letting the names settle in the air, surprised by how quickly they claimed space. Jax and Jolie. They weren't just ideas anymore. They were people with beginnings, with futures she was suddenly responsible for shaping. The fear that followed was real, but it didn't last long. It was replaced by something steadier, a resolve she hadn't known she carried. She dried her hands, wrote the names in her notebook, and underlined them once. No contracts, no witnesses, just her choosing them. Delaney lay awake most nights with the window cracked open, listening to the freight trains pass through town, their low calls echoing across the roofs. The apartment was quiet in a way that made room for thinking. She rested both hands over her stomach and spoke in a whisper meant for no one else. "I don't have much," she told them, "but I have time, and I have patience, and I will show up." She promised them mornings without hurry, even if money stayed tight. She promised them honesty when answers were hard. She promised them a home where they would be seen, not scheduled. Sometimes she imagined telling them about the cafe, about a man who once believed in building things that mattered. Other times she decided those stories could wait. For now, all that mattered was the present, a small apartment, a classroom with cracked paint, 2 names written in ink, and a woman who had learned how to choose herself when no one else would. The ballroom was filled with people who knew Fern's name before they knew his face. Executives leaned across tables to shake his hand. Cameras caught his smile from angles he didn't choose. Somewhere behind the stage, a host mispronounced his last name, then corrected it with a laugh that sounded like it had been rehearsed. He accepted the award because that's what the moment required. A glass plaque was placed in his hands, its surface etched with language about innovation and leadership. The room rose to its feet. Fern nodded in gratitude, stepping into the light with the ease of a man who had learned how to appear comfortable while standing apart. Later, someone clapped him on the back and said, "You've built something incredible." Fernie thanked them because gratitude had become reflex, but the praise slid past him without resistance. It landed nowhere. He remembered the cafe instead, the uneven table, the woman who once fixed his broken machine with a borrowed toolkit and a smile that didn't care what he was worth. That memory came uninvited, then refused to leave. The penthouse overlooked the city from a height that made the streets below look theoretical. At night, Fern could see headlights drawing thin lines across bridges, the motion constant, purposeful, belonging to lives that weren't his. He rarely turned on the living room lights. The space felt too large when it was fully visible, as though illumination only made the absence more obvious. He left his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair he never sat in, and loosened his tie while walking from room to room, searching for something he never named. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, filled with groceries selected by someone else. A delivery box sat unopened by the door. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages that stacked on the screen like unopened mail. He ate standing up, scrolling through headlines that featured his company logo more often than his own reflection. The city didn't ask anything of him. It simply existed below, vast and indifferent. This was what he had wanted. Space, silence, a view. Yet nothing in the apartment seemed to recognize him. The voice arrived when the room was at its quietest. Not in dreams, not during speeches. It came in the moments no one applauded. When he set his phone face down, when the elevator doors closed, when the city below him became nothing but light without detail. "You don't see me anymore." Fern had replayed that line so many times he could no longer remember the exact tone Delaney had used. Calm, steady, not accusing. That was what unsettled him most. He had prepared for anger. He had expected shouting. He had never learned how to defend himself against disappointment spoken without heat. He tried to drown it out with work. He stayed later at the office, took meetings that could have waited, signed off on decisions his team was capable of making alone. He told himself he was needed. The company narrative required him. The growth curve demanded his presence. Still, the words followed. They echoed in empty hallways between offices named after donors. They surfaced while assistants briefed him on travel schedules. They lingered when he paused too long in front of the mirror, wondering when he had started to look like someone else. He had believed success would settle him. Instead, it kept asking what he had traded away. His calendar was full months in advance, yet there were nights when Fern realized he hadn't spoken to another person without a purpose attached in days. Every interaction came with context, negotiations, reports, timelines, as though conversation only existed to move something forward. At events, he was surrounded by people who knew exactly how to approach him. They spoke in careful admiration, asked about expansion plans, hinted at partnerships. Their smiles carried ambition, not curiosity. He learned how to leave early without appearing rude. Back at the penthouse, the elevator opened onto a floor that belonged solely to him. No footsteps echoed from neighboring units. No television murmured behind closed doors. The building's silence was complete, the kind reserved for those who can afford privacy in bulk. He stood by the window and watched the city perform itself below, every light marking a story he would never hear. Success had given him everything measurable, and somehow he had never felt more alone. The phone rang while Fern was in the back seat of a car that cost more than the apartment he'd once shared with Delaney. The city passed in slow motion beyond tinted glass, buildings rising and falling like he was watching someone else's life on mute. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Unknown number. He let it ring once, then twice. The assistant in the front seat was scrolling through messages, already planning the next stop on a schedule that had no gaps left. The call ended, then started again. Hospitals, he would later realize, never try only once. He accepted the call on the second ring, expecting a wrong number or a vendor who had lost the ability to read time zones. "Mr. Ulrich?" a woman asked. Her voice was professional, calm in a way that suggested training rather than reassurance. "This is Memorial Medical. Your former wife, Delaney Shore, has been admitted following an accident. We need to confirm your identity before we proceed." The car felt suddenly too small. "What happened?" he asked, already reaching for the door handle as if distance itself could injure someone. "I'm sorry, sir. I can only provide details once you arrive." The line went quiet. Fern stared at the dark screen in his hand, realizing that the past had just found him, and it wasn't asking whether he was ready. The hospital lobby smelled faintly of antiseptic and floor polish, the kind of clean that tries to erase fear without acknowledging it. Fern moved through the space with the same urgency he brought to boardrooms, except here no one recognized him, and nothing slowed down because of his presence. A nurse met him near the admissions desk, checking his name against a chart with practiced precision. She led him through corridors that branched in too many directions, all painted the same neutral colors as if personality had been intentionally removed. They stopped outside a small consultation room. The door closed behind them, soft but final. "Your former wife is stable," the nurse said. "She's currently sedated for monitoring. There were complications from the accident, but we expect her to regain consciousness." Relief pressed against his chest hard enough to make him dizzy. Then she added, "There's something else. Your ex-wife is pregnant." The sentence didn't register. "Pregnant?" he repeated, certain he'd misheard. "Yes, with twins." The room lost its edges. The months since the divorce rearranged themselves in his mind, revealing an absence he had never questioned, all the days Delaney had lived a life he didn't imagine, all the nights he had chosen distance without realizing how far it could stretch. 2 children, 2 truths he would never be able to unlearn. Fern left the consultation room without knowing where he was going. He walked past vending machines, past a janitor polishing a floor that didn't need it, past a family clustered around a phone call they didn't want to take in public. He stopped in a stairwell between floors, a place no one chose unless they were avoiding something. The door closed behind him with a muted click, and the sound felt louder than any applause he had ever received. His phone slid from his hand and hit the concrete step. He didn't reach for it. He leaned forward instead, bracing both palms against the railing, breathing too fast, the world narrowing to the simple problem of staying upright. Twins. The word repeated until it lost meaning, then found it again with brutal clarity. Delaney had carried this alone, through mornings he never shared, through decisions he never knew existed. He had spent those same months celebrating growth, signing deals, allowing distance to become routine. His throat tightened, not a clean release of tears, something rougher, caught between disbelief and regret. He pressed his forehead to the cool metal rail, eyes closed, trying to locate the man who once fixed broken things in forgotten cafes and wondering how he had let himself become someone who didn't even notice when love left the room. Fern stayed in that stairwell longer than he meant to. The hospital kept functioning around him. Overhead announcements, carts rolling past, the soft closing of doors, but none of it belonged to his moment. He picked up his phone and stared at the cracked screen, thinking of all the calls he had postponed with the promise of later. He wondered how many truths had lived inside those silences. Have you ever learned something about someone you loved when there was no way to go back and do it differently? If that feeling is familiar, share it in the comments. Stories like this only matter when they remind us how fragile timing really is. The nurse walked him to a room tucked at the end of the corridor, away from the steady traffic of visitors and carts. The door was half closed, light slipping through the narrow opening like it was hesitant to intrude. Fern paused before stepping inside. He had negotiated hostile takeovers. He had stood before crowds that waited to judge him. None of that prepared him for the sight of Delaney lying still beneath thin hospital blankets, her hair brushed back from her face, her breathing measured by a machine that marked time in soft mechanical pulses. He stayed near the doorway at first, uncertain of his place, as if he needed permission to occupy the same air again. The room held no trace of their past, no photographs, no personal objects, only a woman who had once been his entire world reduced to monitored rhythms and taped wires. He took a single step closer, then another, each one deliberate. "I'm here," he said quietly, not sure whether he was speaking to her or to himself. Fern pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat, folding his hands together, the way he did when he was waiting for a verdict. Too quiet to absorb what he couldn't. He watched Delaney breathe. The rise and fall was subtle, barely enough to disturb the blanket. He had once measured his days in meetings and outcomes. Now he measured them in moments when her chest lifted again. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it without checking. There was no urgency left anywhere else. For the first time in years, he didn't have a strategy. No explanation waited on his tongue. The confidence that usually filled rooms had no function here. All that remained was a man sitting beside a woman he might lose, discovering that fear doesn't care what your title is. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the thin blue line of a monitor he barely understood, and hoped that if he stayed still long enough, the world might give him another chance to speak when it mattered. Delaney stirred without warning. It was slight at first, a shift of fingers, a change in the rhythm of her breath. But Fern noticed instantly. He straightened in the chair, heart climbing into his throat, unsure whether he was allowed to hope. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused, searching. They found the ceiling, then the wall, then finally him. "Fern?" Her voice barely traveled beyond her lips. He was on his feet before the name had finished leaving her mouth. "I'm here." Confusion crossed her face, the kind that follows sleep that isn't natural. Why are you? "You had an accident," he said gently, careful not to crowd her. "You're safe now, the doctors are watching everything." She blinked again, piecing together a reality that didn't include him. Her gaze drifted to the side, then returned, uncertain but present. "I didn't tell you," she murmured, as if that explained his sudden appearance. "I know," he replied, "and it's okay." His voice surprised him with its steadiness. Delaney's eyes stayed on him as though she were afraid the room might rearrange itself if she looked away. "You don't have to be here," she said, the words thin from effort rather than distance. He shook his head. The gesture felt unfamiliar, like learning a new language with his body instead of his mouth. "I should have been here before," he said. "Not just now. Not just because someone else called me." She closed her eyes briefly, the kind of blink people use when they're deciding whether to trust a moment. "They're yours," she whispered. The statement didn't come with expectation. It was simply the truth, offered without defense. Fern reached for her hand, stopping an inch short until she didn't pull away. When their fingers finally met, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself in years. Responsibility without calculation. "I won't leave again," he said. No schedule, no qualifiers, just the promise itself standing in the open. Delaney studied his face as though searching for the man she once knew and the one he had become. "Stay," she said. And this time, he did. The chair was designed to discourage comfort. Its back leaned at an angle that promised nothing and delivered less. The vinyl surface trapped heat, then gave it back without mercy. Fern discovered this on his second night in the hospital, when the hour slipped past midnight and the building entered the hushed state reserved for places that never truly sleep. He had intended to go home after Delaney opened her eyes. He had told himself it made sense. He could return in the morning with coffee and clean clothes and a better version of himself. But when the room dimmed and the hall quieted, he remained. He tried to lie across the chair and immediately gave up. So he sat instead, jacket folded beneath his head, eyes closing in intervals that lasted minutes at most. Each time he drifted, a sound pulled him back. The soft change in a machine's tone, the distant roll of a cart, the murmur of voices passing the door. In boardrooms, Fern had learned how to claim space without apology. Here he learned the opposite, how to occupy a corner without disturbing the fragile calm around a woman who had been carrying more than he ever knew. He woke just before dawn with his neck stiff and his thoughts strangely clear. Waiting, he realized, was not passive. It demanded attention. By the third day, Fern's phone battery lasted longer than his patience used to. He stopped checking email entirely. The messages stacked in silence, while his gaze stayed fixed on the small monitor beside Delaney's bed, learning its patterns the way he once learned profit charts. The gentle rise and fall of numbers mattered more than anything waiting in his inbox. A nurse explained what each line meant, which ones to worry about, and which ones simply marked time. Fern listened with the focus he usually reserved for negotiations, nodding, asking questions, storing the knowledge away as if it were something he could master. Delaney slept often, waking in brief windows to drink water or answer questions she barely remembered later. In those intervals, Fern spoke less and noticed more, the way her brow furrowed when pain flickered, the way her hand searched the edge of the bed when she didn't know he was there. He didn't try to fix anything. He stayed, and the act of staying, stripped of goals and metrics, felt like learning a skill he had ignored his entire life. Time moved differently in the hospital. It didn't reward efficiency. It didn't care how quickly he responded to problems elsewhere. It simply passed, indifferent to ambition. Fern noticed this on the fourth night, when a nurse paused to adjust Delaney's blanket and whispered, "She does better when she knows someone's here." He had built a career on decisive action, on the belief that momentum solved everything. Waiting had always felt like waste. Now it felt like responsibility. He began to anticipate the small things. The hour when Delaney usually stirred, the kind of light that bothered her eyes, the questions she forgot she'd already asked. He kept water within reach. He memorized the schedule for checks and tests. None of it earned praise. No one wrote articles about men who learned how to sit quietly beside a hospital bed. But something inside him shifted anyway. For the first time, Fern wasn't measuring his worth by what he could control. He was measuring it by how well he could remain present when control no longer belonged to him. Fern waited until the room was quiet. Delaney had fallen into a deeper sleep, the kind that loosened the lines around her eyes. The hallway lights were dimmed, and the monitor beside the bed marked time in steady numbers that no longer startled him. He stood at the foot of the bed for a long moment, uncertain where to place himself. It felt wrong to hover. It felt wrong to leave. So he settled into the chair again, close enough to feel like he belonged, far enough to avoid waking her. His eyes drifted to the gentle curve beneath the blanket, a shape he was only beginning to understand. 2 lives were growing there, connected to him by more than biology and less than experience. He cleared his throat, embarrassed by the sound in the quiet room. "Hi," he said, not to Delaney but to what lay beyond her. "I don't know if you can hear anything yet. The nurse said you might. I hope that's true." The words felt clumsy. He had delivered keynote addresses without hesitation, but this was different. There were no talking points for becoming a father overnight. "I should have been here sooner," he continued, voice low. "I miss things I can't get back, but I'm here now, and I'm going to keep showing up." He waited, absurdly, for an answer that would never come. Yet the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like an opening. Fern had discovered the parenting aisle by accident. He had gone down to the hospital bookstore looking for coffee strong enough to challenge exhaustion. Instead, he found himself standing in front of a wall of pastel-colored covers that promised reassurance in bold lettering. Titles about feeding schedules, sleep patterns, developmental milestones, a vocabulary he had never bothered to learn. He checked over his shoulder before picking one up, aware of how ridiculous secrecy felt in a place built on vulnerability. Still, he carried the book to the counter like contraband. Back in the room, he read in fragments. 10 minutes here, a few pages there. He learned about the way babies recognize voices before faces, about how touch can settle fear long before language exists. Each paragraph left a bruise of regret. These were things Delaney had been learning alone, things he might have known months earlier if he hadn't trusted distance to keep everything manageable. He underlined lines with a borrowed pen, folding corners despite the pristine cover, as though marking the text might mark him in return. He didn't tell anyone what he was studying. This was work he wanted to do quietly, not to be seen improving, but to be prepared. By the end of the week, Fern could predict when Delaney would wake before she did. He recognized the subtle changes in her breathing, the way her hand drifted toward the edge of the bed when pain returned. He placed the book face down on the chair whenever she stirred, unsure how to explain the version of himself he was becoming. At night, when the hallway quieted and the past pressed in, he felt the weight of everything he had missed. He pictured the months Delaney had spent alone, the clinic visit, the drive back to a small apartment, the moment she chose names without him. Each image settled somewhere behind his ribs, heavy but necessary. Yet hope followed close behind the regret. He imagined teaching 2 children how to fix things instead of replacing them, how to listen instead of assuming, how to choose people over progress. He didn't know if he deserved any of that, but sitting there, watching Delaney sleep while 2 unseen heartbeats kept time inside her, he understood something he had never learned in boardrooms or corner offices. Becoming a father wasn't about readiness. It was about deciding to stay, even when the future had already begun without you. Fern didn't sell the penthouse right away. He walked through it one last time while the city prepared for another evening below, touching nothing, as if fingerprints might convince him to stay. The walls reflected his shape back at him, tall and successful and oddly detached from the person he felt like becoming. He boxed only what mattered: clothes that didn't carry boardroom expectations, a framed photo from years ago that showed two people smiling in a cafe that no longer existed. Everything else he left for someone who still believed space was a reward. When he handed the keys to the building manager, the gesture felt symbolic in ways he couldn't explain. The apartment had been designed to impress. It had never learned how to hold him. He drove out of the city with traffic thinning behind him, trading Skyline for power lines and storefronts that closed early. No announcements followed him. No headlines cared where he was going. For the first time, he wasn't choosing a place that elevated his image. He was choosing one that might hold a family. The house sat on a street that didn't bother with names. Mailboxes leaned at uneven angles, their numbers fading under years of sun. The porch light buzzed faintly even in daylight, a reminder that nothing here was perfect, and no one pretended otherwise. Delaney stood in the doorway when Fern arrived, one hand resting on her stomach, the other tucked into the pocket of a sweater that had seen better seasons. She hadn't yet learned how to stand without wincing, but she didn't mention it. "It's small," she said. "It's right," he replied, surprising them both. The rooms were narrow enough that you could hear someone moving in the kitchen from the bedroom. The windows opened instead of sealing the world out. Dust hung in the air, caught in light that didn't need permission to enter. Fern carried in boxes that had been labeled in a hurry, his handwriting unfamiliar to him. Nothing matched. Nothing needed to. That night they ate on the floor because the table hadn't arrived yet. It wasn't efficient. It was the first shared meal they'd had in months. The crib came in a box nearly as tall as Fern was. He dragged it into the spare room with the confidence of someone who had overseen mergers and acquisitions, then opened it to discover a chaos of wooden slats, screws sorted into tiny plastic bags, and a folded sheet of directions written in a language that seemed determined to remain abstract. Delaney sat on the edge of the bed watching him work, offering nothing but raised eyebrows when he insisted he didn't need help. An hour passed, then two. At some point, the pieces on the floor began to look less like a bed and more like evidence of personal failure. Fern turned the instruction sheet upside down, then sideways, hoping orientation might reveal meaning. He muttered, staring at a structure that leaned dramatically to one side. Delaney laughed. It was sudden, uncontrolled. It startled them both. She covered her mouth, then dropped her hand when the sound kept coming. "You used to make everything look so easy," she said between breaths. "I forgot you were human." He grinned, sitting back on his heels. "I'm learning from scratch." The crib eventually came together, crooked but sincere, and the room felt lighter for it. Delaney didn't laugh again for a long time after that. She stood in the doorway watching Fern tighten the last screw with the wrong tool, his tie discarded on the dresser like a forgotten habit. The sound that finally escaped her wasn't polished or controlled. It came from somewhere deeper, a place that hadn't been asked to participate in months. It didn't fix anything. The house was still too small. The future was still uncertain. The crib leaned just enough to remind them it had been assembled by hope rather than skill. But laughter has a way of changing a room without asking permission. Fern looked up at her, startled, then relieved, then grateful all at once. He didn't try to join the sound. He let it belong to her. For the first time since the hospital, the weight between them lifted, not completely, not permanently, but enough to suggest that what they were building now might not resemble what they had lost. It might be better. The house had learned their routines. Evenings settled into predictable rhythms, dishes washed while the radio played softly, Fern folding laundry in ways that suggested effort rather than experience, Delaney pausing often to catch her breath without asking for it. The ordinary nature of it all made room for thoughts that had been held back too long. One night, while the kettle heated on the stove, Delaney broke the pattern. "Why didn't you fight for us?" She didn't turn around when she said it. The words floated between them without urgency, but they changed the temperature of the room all the same. Fern stopped mid-fold, a shirt half smoothed on the couch. He had imagined this moment often enough to believe he'd prepared for it. Yet the question landed heavier than any he'd rehearsed. "I thought I was," he said slowly. Delaney faced him then, eyes steady, not looking for defense. "That's not what I asked." He set the shirt aside. There were no charts for this, no forecasts, just the truth waiting to be named. Fern took longer to answer than he meant to. He moved to the chair across from Delaney, lowering himself as if the furniture required a certain humility he hadn't practiced in years. The kettle clicked off behind them, forgotten. "I was afraid," he said at last. The word felt inadequate, a label for something he had spent a lifetime avoiding. "Afraid of what?" she asked. He considered the room, the unfinished paint near the doorframe, the crooked crib visible down the hall, then met her eyes. "I was afraid that if I stopped pushing, everything I'd built would disappear," he admitted. "That if I chose you too openly, I'd fail at the only thing I knew how to be good at." Delaney listened without interrupting, her hands folded in her lap the way they had been in the boardroom. "So you chose work," she said. "I chose control," he corrected. "I thought if I kept things moving, I wouldn't have to feel how uncertain I really was." He exhaled slowly, as if the confession required air he hadn't been allowed before. "I didn't fight because I didn't trust myself to lose anything and still survive." Delaney let his words settle before speaking again. "I was afraid too," she said. "Afraid that asking for more meant I was asking you to be someone else. Afraid that if I pushed, I'd be the reason everything fell apart." She reached for his hand, not to absolve him, not to correct the past, but to acknowledge the shared weight of it. "We kept trying to protect ourselves," she continued, "and in doing that, we stopped protecting each other." Fern felt something ease that he hadn't known he was carrying. The conversation didn't end in forgiveness or resolution. It ended in understanding, the kind that doesn't erase mistakes but changes how they're held. They sat together, neither of them victorious, neither defeated. Just two people learning that vulnerability isn't about winning or losing. It's about staying in the room when the truth finally arrives. The pain woke Delaney before the sun did. At first it was a pressure she tried to ignore, the way she had learned to ignore so many things over the last year. She lay still, listening to the house settle around her, counting the quiet spaces between the sensations in her body. Then it returned, sharper this time, leaving no room for doubt. She shifted carefully, one hand bracing the edge of the mattress. Fern stirred beside her, still learning the rhythms of sleep that didn't involve alarms. "Fern," she whispered. He was upright in seconds, panic arriving before clarity. "Is it time?" She nodded, breath uneven but controlled. "I think so." The room filled with motion. Drawers opening, keys clattering against the counter, the hum of the engine starting before the garage door was fully raised. The street outside was empty, unaware that two lives were about to enter it. As they drove, Delaney stared out the window, holding space inside herself for children she had only met through names. Jax, Jolie. They were reminded of nothing else. The hospital moved them through doors that opened only for moments like this. Fear stayed close, answering questions he barely processed, holding Delaney's hand whenever the pace slowed enough to allow it. Time lost its usual shape. It became a sequence of small instructions, steady voices, and the quiet understanding that nothing else in the world mattered. Then it was over in the only way that counts, with two small lives announced to the room. A nurse placed the first baby into Fern's arms before he had time to think. The weight surprised him, not because it was heavy, but because it was real in a way nothing else had ever been. He looked down at a face still learning how to exist and felt something inside him reorganize. "This is Jax," Delaney said softly, her voice tired but certain. Fern nodded, unable to speak yet. He held Jax close, aware of how instinctively careful his hands had become. Moments later, another nurse guided a second bundle toward him. "And this is Jolie." He adjusted his arms, creating space he didn't know he had. Two children, two beginnings. For the first time, Fern wasn't thinking about what came next. He was exactly where he needed to be. Later, when the room settled and the voices receded, Fern stood near the window with Jax and Jolie asleep in the bassinets beside Delaney's bed. The city beyond the glass looked the same as it always had. Traffic moving, buildings glowing, but it felt like a different place entirely. He studied their faces, searching for anything familiar, then realizing that nothing he had ever accomplished compared to the responsibility resting a few feet away. The months that had once defined him, contracts signed, accolades collected, distances justified, rearranged themselves into something smaller, less important. Every choice he had postponed now waited for him in a room that smelled faintly of clean linen and beginnings. Delaney reached for his hand. He took it without thinking. "Everything's different," she said. He didn't argue. He couldn't, because for the first time in his life, Fern understood that success wasn't something you achieved. It was something you stayed for. There were no press releases, no glossy photos appeared online, no headlines framed Fern's return to a life that didn't revolve around contracts or corner offices. The business pages found new stories to follow, and his name drifted quietly off the front of their lists. The house filled instead with ordinary sounds, a door creaking when opened too quickly, the soft rustle of blankets, the distant whistle of a train passing through town before dawn. It was a life that offered nothing to celebrate publicly, yet everything to learn privately. Fern didn't correct anyone who assumed he was on an extended break or a personal retreat. Letting go of visibility felt like relief rather than loss. The absence of attention gave them space to exist without explanation. The nights belonged to them, not in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet rhythm that develops when two people must cooperate before thinking has fully returned. Fern learned the difference between Jax's restlessness and Jolie's hunger. Delaney discovered that Fern woke faster than she did now, moving through the dark by memory rather than light. They didn't keep score. There was no tally of who had done more. Some mornings they greeted the sun sitting on opposite sides of the couch, each holding a child, exhaustion settling between them like a shared language. They spoke in murmurs, careful not to wake what they had just managed to settle. Trust returned in small gestures, a hand on the back when someone was fading, a nod that meant, "I've got this one." There were no grand apologies, only presence. Trust did not return in declarations. It returned in grocery lists taped to the fridge, in Fern remembering which brand of formula Jolie tolerated, in Delaney sleeping for a full 2 hours because someone else had decided she didn't need to listen for every sound. They made mistakes without drama, a bottle mixed wrong, a diaper left on backward in the confusion of early morning. None of it carried the weight of failure it once might have. Sometimes Delaney caught Fern standing in the doorway of the nursery long after both children were asleep, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak in those moments. He simply remained, as if anchoring himself to something real. It was easy to miss how much had changed if you were only looking for proof that shouted. Redemption, they were learning, prefers to whisper. One afternoon, long after the house had stopped feeling unfamiliar, Delaney watched Fern rock Jax to sleep in the narrow chair by the window. The light coming in didn't flatter anything. It revealed exhaustion, creased clothing, a life stripped of polish. And yet it was the most honest thing she had ever seen. Somewhere between hospital nights and grocery lists, they had stopped trying to repair the past and started showing up for the present. Not because they had fixed everything, but because they no longer expected perfection from each other. If you know someone who's struggling to believe that broken things can still become whole, share this story with them. Sometimes hope doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it comes quietly, carried in tired arms at the end of a very long night. Love rarely ends in the ways people expect. There is no moment that feels large enough to carry the weight of everything that's been lost. No dramatic scene that fully explains how two people who once shared coffee from chipped mugs can end up signing papers across a table that's too wide for connection. Most love doesn't collapse. It thins. It thins through late replies that become normal, through postponed conversations that stop being rescheduled, through small absences that seem harmless until they stack high enough to block the view of the person sitting right in front of you. Fern didn't stop caring about Delaney. He stopped choosing her. And Delaney didn't stop loving him. She stopped asking him to stay. Neither of them intended to disappear from the other's life. They simply trusted that what mattered most would survive on memory alone. It didn't. Redemption, when it arrived, didn't feel like a victory. It didn't announce itself with relief or certainty. It looked like folding laundry in a house that still smelled like paint. It sounded like a newborn crying at 3 a.m, and someone else already moving to answer it. It felt like two people relearning how to exist without armor. Presence is not loud. It doesn't make promises. It keeps them. It shows up when the outcome is unclear. It remains when apology is no longer enough. It chooses the person in the room over the idea of a better future waiting somewhere else. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Ambition is not a flaw. Success is not a mistake. But neither of them can replace attention. And sometimes the miracle isn't the career you built or the image you perfected. Sometimes the miracle is learning how to stay.